What's up, fellow gamers? Phreak here. I'm the design lead of Summoner's Rift Team's live pod, and it's time to talk about patch 14.16. This is going to be the playoff patch for many esports leagues around the world. We are gearing up towards World Patch, which I believe is 0.18. So we're not being, we are like both overtly and not overtly being kind of pro focused. So I would say, in actual honesty, this patch is solo queue focused, though we are aware of the pro metagame. So a couple things about this. The metagame in pro play is different than the solo queue metagame for 99.5% of players. So you have to pretty much go into Grandmaster Plus before you actually have AD carries being the three most picked mid laners and like champions in mid laners overall. For the vast majority of players, it's still Yasuo, Yone, LeBlanc, Katarina, Zed, etc. Even if you're like, now only show me like Diamond 2 and up, like show me the top like 1.5% of players. It's still completely normal stuff you've seen for years on end. It's the sub like 1%, 0.1% grouping where it's like, ADCs are taking over. Now, to be clear, that will always tend to slowly percolate downstream. That will tend to, continue to happen. And so the fact that it's happening in pro and high level solo queue means that it's the kind of thing where it's worth acting on because it indicates that other things are wrong, which I believe to be true. I think there are issues in the game right now, and it's worth doing some retuning on things. So though a lot of these things are like, oh, that looks like you did it because of pro play. It is more than just pro play. It's also elite solo queue, and those things will also tend to have knock-on effects down the line as well. So otherwise, though, there's a set of buffs, and so one thing that's odd here, right, is there are several champions buffing this patch where people will be like, wait a second, I know that champion. That champion has been in pro play before. And so here's the weird thing, right, is there's plenty of champions that pros just simply overlook, and they're already appropriately balanced for solo queue. So, for example, last split, we buffed Akali right before MSI. We didn't think Akali was weak. We just wanted to see Akali more in a big pro tournament. And so we buffed Akali, knowing she didn't need to be buffed, and then, unsurprisingly, we nerfed her a couple patches later. We can do that. Of course, we did for MSI. We probably will do this for a couple of champions for Worlds. I would expect us to do that a couple of times. But what I would rather do is buff things that actually have room to buff, because for example, there's buffs to Vi, Wukong, and Azir this patch. Guess what? Yeah, we've seen these champs in pro a lot before. But thing is, all of them are weak in solo queue because they were pro jailed in the past. As soon as they are not pro jailed, it's like, oh, we have free real estate to buff these champions. Why wouldn't we? They're currently weak. And so that's the tough thing, right? Is we're gonna keep seeing this back and forth of like, to me, like the ideal pro presence for a champion is around 30%. And for many of these champions, it's like, oh, this champ's supposed to have like a 48% win rate, or it's supposed to have a 51% win rate, and they're like 2% below that mark. It's like, well, if they're already below 30% pro presence, it's a win all around because we get another occasional pro pick, and they're supposed to be stronger in solo queue. And then in some cases, it's like, well, we could buff this like we could, for example, further buff LeBlanc to like really make sure we have some AP mid laners. But LeBlanc is already as strong as she's supposed to be in solo queue. And just like this exists for several champions and whatnot. So that's kind of the tough part here, right? Where we could definitely buff things in order to create more variance in the metagame, but it would be buffing a champion we know is already appropriately strong, and that seems incorrect to me in many cases. Anyway, let's start going into the individual changes here and a preface on this patch and some timing as well. So let's first talk about the fact that we are doing some work in future. So LivePod is working on some stuff. Now, there's actually several cool things happening for Split 3, which is going to be the split after Worlds this year. Some of which is not happening from LivePod, but really cool stuff all the same. But there are some really cool projects that LivePod are working on that I want to bring up. And so the tough thing, right, is we have a limited number of designers to do work any given week and any given day, right? And if we're ever focused more on future term stuff, and so some of the examples of things that LivePod did was like the anti-snowball update in 1320, just like as an example of something that was like received really well, and like, hey, that requires time and iteration, and does, this set of changes work? Does that set of changes work? Does this thing work? Does that thing work? And generally speaking, right, this takes time, this takes iteration, which means it is not time and iteration, time spent on like researching the state of live or researching the state of current esports matches or implementing changes that are intended to go live next patch. And so as we gear up for things like split 3 changes, we have less time to focus on investigating live, and so we're going to generally have slightly smaller live patches when this happens. This is the case here, where basically all the designers on live are working at least part of their time towards split 3. And there's other stuff that we're doing that's even farther down the line that I can't talk about, but like, we're doing other stuff that's not just the live game, or it's going to be live in 2 months, or it's going to be live in 6 months or something, right? And again, that's hours per week spent here. So I wanted to bring up some of the topics that we are investigating here and thinking about and trying to develop towards, some of which is actually going live this patch, some of which will go on later. So one, which is not my project, but I, the design lead of Live, so of course I'm overseeing this kind of stuff, but it's, broadly speaking, investigating lane dynamics, maybe specifically the Summoner Spell Teleport. So a problem statement would be, I solo kill my lane opponent, and I'm punished for doing so because they TP back to the lane and freeze on me. So you'll notice that actually later on in this patch, we'll talk about it in probably 10 minutes, there are changes to death timers and the home guard buff you get when you die. There are no direct teleport nerfs, but there are indirect teleport nerfs based on giving champions a bunch of out-of-combat move speed when they respawn. That move speed doesn't matter when you teleport, and it does when you don't teleport. That is an indirect TP nerf for the laning phase. But overall, spending more time thinking about what should these sort of long lane, side lane dynamics look like, and what should the interactions be, what should be rewarded, what shouldn't be rewarded, what are the kinds of things we can create that are interesting, and like, what is the right level of advantage to gain when getting a kill? Like, if you solo kill your opponent and they don't have TP, should the lane be over? My instinct is no, it should not be over. If you get 2-0'd, yeah, your lane's probably screwed. That's on you for dying twice in a row. But like, if the only way to not be screwed off of 1 and 0 is to have TP, that's not a state we want, right? And so it's like, okay, really cultivating out the statements of what is appropriate, actually placing the line, like placing the flag in the ground. Okay, can we develop towards these goals? Can we have these things be what happens here? And so, it's investigating exactly what we want that state to be. And then what are the things that we can pull? What are the levers we can pull? Are there new things we need to invent into the game? And new mechanics we need to add to make these things happen? How can we achieve these goals? And so this could be split 3. This could be season start next year. This could be later if it doesn't work. Again, there are some small stuff in this patch that we'll talk about a little bit later, but this is one of the things that, again, takes time to iterate on. The next thing is the power level of items right now. So I spent almost a full week jotting down literally every item in the game, trying to actually objectively quantify the power level of that item, and then make comparisons and then make changes to right now in playtesting in our future environments. We've got an overhaul to literally every single item in League of Legends. Now, I think 6 of them have 0 changes, and I think 2 of them have buffs, and the rest are nerfs. These nerfs could be as small as 1 or 2%, and they could be as large as 15%. At least 15% relative to when I started doing the research, which was even before 0.15 went live. So it's like, version 1 of the sheet had like old Kraken Slayer, old Shiv on them. I then update the numbers to how big the nerf actually is, relative to live. But like, oh, okay, when I quantify how strong Kraken Slayer is and Static Shiv is and Blade of the Ruin King is compared to items in the same class, like other ADC items in other classes, fighter items, tank items, whatever, what are these power levels at? And then contrasting things like fighter items to tank items. Spoiler alert, tank items really suck. Tank items are the overall weakest item class right now in League of Legends. We could, of course, drip in some tank item buffs over time. Of course, we can, slide in item nerfs everywhere else down the line as well. Or really, it's going to be both. We're going to have a really big item tuning pass at Split 3, which have 2 goals. So one, it is bringing the relative power level of different classes of items into line. Again, using 0.15 or 0.14 as the sort of like 0.0, AD carry items are nerfed the most by like 2% on average, and tank items are nerfed the least by, I think, 3% less than whatever is like 4th place here, right? Broadly looking at like, what are fighter items? identifying that there are multiple classes of fighter. There's juggernauts, there's skirmishers, there's divers, and there's kind of stuff in between. Looking at tank items, looking at AD assassin items, looking at AP items overall, acknowledging that there are assassins, there are battle mages, there are artillery and whatnot. People have mana, people don't. Looking at enchanter items overall, looking at all these classes, and then saying, okay, well, where are they now? Where should they be? What are the actual appropriate gold values to place on these individual stats to have these items make sense? Obviously, just like dividing Fairy Charm by the amount of regen is not the actual price of mana regen. Dividing Sapphire Crystal by the amount of mana is not what the actual gold value of mana is. Right, there's plenty of items where the basic item is tuned for if you were to buy it on like at level 1 or on first recall versus what the item is actually worth when you're level 10 or 11 or 12 or whatever. And these are very, very different, right? And so it's planting a decent flag in the ground of what does mana actually cost in a mature build, what is ability power and ability haste and magic pen and percent armor pen and lethality, what do these actually cost a mature build, what is crit damage worth, and then actually digging into it. And yeah, in some cases items are nerfed, individual items can be nerfed as much as 15 to 20%, and again in some cases it's literally buffed 1 to 2% for items that are actually just kind of weak right now and not really getting played. I think right now Overlord's Bloodmail is like nerfed by 1% compared to like other items that are nerfed way more. Anyway, and so some of this is like, okay, we could trickle in some of these over time. So Blade of the Ruin King nerf, Kraken Slayer nerf, Static Shift nerf, right? Like these are things that we can trickle in over time. But in general, what I would expect this to do, if and when it goes live, is number one, the game will be less snowbally because the value of gold will go down. And so how much you are screwed by being denied gold is going to be less important. And how much someone is ahead by farming plates off you or killing you 3 times or whatever is also going to be less ahead because what they got from their 3,000 gold is just going to be less powerful. So not only will there be less snowballing, but also the overall pace of late game combat will slow down. Now, these nerfs are not all flat. It's not like, we're going to take every stat off a mage item and nerf them all by 5%. It's like, let's make sure that Luden's Tempest, Luden's Companion now, rather, is clearly a burst item. So if this item needs to go down, we're going to take away some haste. And, here's Malignance. Malignance is about having ultimates. Okay, well, the net ulti hasten's item is not going to go very far compared to how much haste like an item like Luden's might lose. What does it need? What doesn't it need? One of the big things is trying to take some of the scaling off of items. So when I did the 80 carry item update and I moved Kraken Slayer from being a mythic into a legendary, is I basically kept the scaling profile that it had when it was a mythic item, because that was the point of mythic items. Mythic items are meant to keep up and always be really important, and that is no longer how we think about items. Items to me are a bit more disposable. You buy them for a specific purpose, and if that purpose gets outscaled, that's fine. Part of the reason I had Kraken Slayer scale was that, well, maybe you'll go to like item 5 on an on-hit build and think about, what about Kraken Slayer? I didn't buy that yet. And that's no longer what I want here. That's no longer the goal of the system. And so it's like, well, we can lower the scaling on Kraken Slayer. We can lower the scaling on Wit's End. We can potentially lower the scaling on things like Sunfire or other items as well, where it's like, actually, these things could be good power spikes, and you're meant to buy Sunfire first, and it gives you wave for congratulations. It doesn't need to like kill champions harder. In some cases, it's removing the 4th unique passive off an item because it doesn't need it anymore. And there's probably going to be some missteps here as well. Of course, I'll probably get some things wrong, but it's really skewed towards removing late game power when you're buying. Again, I'll just use Sunfire Cape as an example here. Sunfire Cape is not meaningfully nerfed compared to other items because, again, tanks are the least nerfed item class. But it's like, hey, if we made Sunfire Cape scale damage with time much less, then tanks just deal less late game damage, which they don't need to deal at 35 minutes because they're team fighting. They don't need to finish, like, they're never going to 1v1 Darius anyway. There's no point in remotely trying to give them the damage to beat Darius because they never will. What's the point in trying? This way, Zach won't one-shot Zeri as easily. That's a good thing. It should, be an assassin that does, and we're basically not nerfing. In a lot of cases, I'm actually buffing the lethality values on assassin items and the magic pen values on magic pen items, but, nerfing haste in some cases and moving items around. And another thing is by nerfing tank items the least, fighters will be more likely or more willing to consider a tank item, and they're like, wow, I really need an armor item against this 5 AD team comp. Well, don't worry. The power delta between Randuin's Omen and Steric's Gauge is a lot smaller now, so you're not griefing by not always building the fighter item. You're allowed to counterbuild the tank item, right? And like those are all things that are valuable here that will end up being happening. So less snowballing, more choice structure for fighters, less like slower late game combat pacing, and there's more to do for sure. I think we've definitely given many tanks a lot of late game damage that would actually require more things like kit updates to do, but broadly speaking, this is kind of the look at this going on right now, which fingers crossed will launch at Split 3. Another project we're working on is re-investigating bounties in terms of how they work under the hood and how much we want them to output. The version of this that is in testing right now, CS bounties are gone, and the total and now bounties themselves, like the bounty on you when you kill somebody, will scale based on how much gold they were actually worth. So being 10-0 by killing a 100 gold scion will not be the same bounty as being 10-0 by killing everyone on the enemy team twice, because understanding that you're only getting 100 gold for the Scion means you shouldn't grow as much bounty on yourself anymore. And similar things for when you're in the negatives and you're like, I'm the 0 and 10 guy, I'm doing really, really poorly. You won't necessarily instantly reset to being worth 300 gold just off getting one shutdown, or just like you randomly last hit a Sona and now you're worth 300 gold again, and you're going to keep feeding. And so this will generally, on average, lower the amount of gold in the game, but it will also make you less penalized for winning, because the amount of bounty you have will be much more directly related to the amount of gold you've actually earned from getting this bounty. Now, this means that 7-0 champions will have different bounties from one another, and I'm counting on y'all to be able to understand why that's different. That's a risk, because you will see this guy's 7-0, that guy's 7-0, why is my bounty bigger? Which, to be fair, currently exists with CS bounties, and we're currently getting rid of that. But 7-0 are not made the same when you're killing somebody who's 0 and 7 versus you're killing somebody who is, already, worth 300 gold when you killed them. So things to think about there. I'm hopeful this is going to work out well. Generally speaking, again, you are going to be less. And what's cool as well, actually, here with this, is your negative bounty as well. Like when you go down below 300 gold, that will also care about the amount of gold given out. Instead of just being a death streak and -1, -2, -3, -4 is just plugs into a formula. That formula instead cares about how much gold you gave away, which means being solo killed lowers your bounty by less than if you were killed during a gank. So this technically, like, slightly nerfs junglers. This is not an intended consequence, but it will be true, where like assisted kills will tend to deprecate champions faster. But it also means that if you are someone doing solo killing, the jacks that you're solo killing or the team that you're solo killing is going to decrement gold more slowly if you're solo killing them versus if they're getting killed by an assist, because they're giving away 50% more gold if their kill is assisted, right? And so they should decrement faster. And so there's a lot of interesting things around this. Makes solo lanes more valuable, or kind of, I should say, like, stronger overall, right? Winning via solo kills gives you less bounty. Dying by getting ganked rushes you down a little bit faster, but also makes you more valuable to your like solo kill lane opponent if they were soloing you, and so you're like a slightly more valuable bag of gold. This is like very lightly top lane has more power as a result. Again, not directly the goal here, but it's going to happen. Anyway, the rework on bounties, so far it's going to be mostly around tuning and whatnot, but yeah, that's in testing. And so yeah, those are the things from live pod going to Split 3. So far there's some other stuff, but right now I'm not talking about them. Regardless. But because we're working on things like this and doing the design work or doing the design consultation, because an engineer has to implement this, we just don't have as much time to investigate live at this current state in time, right? That said, though, we got +1 designer. So we got a designer over from the modes team. He was recently working on Arena. Not Arena, sorry. I know what the code name is, but I'm trying to remember what it's actually. Swarm. He was working on Swarm. He is now on live pod. His first day was yesterday, which is kind of getting thrown to the wolves, because that's when we do the meeting and planning for reactive balance, and then we immediately need to like scramble together like 5 to 7 change lists and get them like shipped within 48 hours. So, a little bit of a trial by fire for onboarding, but hey, we have +1 designer. We also had one of our designers out sick, so the total manpower was unchanged for the end of this patch. Whatever. Either way, though, I'm excited that Live has more design resources, because this means we can look at more things and still cover the game faithfully and whatnot. So very happy about that. Very excited that in the immediate future we will have more throughput, which I'm very happy about. Okay, let's move on to what's actually in this patch itself. We're 18 minutes in. Let's talk about this patch, okay? Up first, a big systems change to death timers and the home guard buff you get when you die. So up levels 1 through 8, the death timer is 4 seconds longer. At level 9, it's 3 seconds longer. And then at level 10 and beyond, death timer is unchanged. Beyond that, though, the home guard buff you get when you die, the duration of that move speed buff is being increased by 3 seconds. Now, to be clear, this buff is not gained 100% move speed, so these do not directly cancel out. Indeed, this will this will directly say that you will spend more time out of your lane, whether you have TP or not. Now, the amount of time you spend out of the lane will be less increased for non-TP users, because if you have teleport, it's just plus 4 seconds. If you don't have teleport, it's plus 4 minus 1 or so is the math will maybe work by this buff duration. But a bigger change actually is that so the Death Home Guard buff, the way the buff is hooked up, it's actually really easy to change, and it's changed here. Is the duration never showed, it never ticked, even though it has a duration, and buffs with a duration will usually show a timer. And that timer started the second you spawned. So if you respawn and said, wait, I need to shop, or I need to wait for like 10 gold to buy an item, your death timer home guards are falling off. And sorry, they're gone. You're not getting back to lane in time. You have no buff. Instead of, 6 seconds of buff or 9 seconds of buff, you have no buff. So this has been changed to only fall off when you leave the platform. And so what's going to happen is if you die and you're like, but I need 5 gold, so I need to wait like 3 seconds to like buy a longsword, that's okay. Now you get the full duration of your Death Home Guard buff to get back to lane faster. And again, if you had teleport, it didn't matter. You didn't use this. In fact, you would buy the item while channeling TP, and it was literally free time. So this is fairly subtle, but I think actually really, really meaningful in terms of making it feel a lot better to be on the receiving end of like, wow, I died. Hang on, I need this cloth armor. Let me wait 6 seconds. Don't worry, this buff is still on, and you get to run back to lane faster. So I think this will be very impactful in the average case for the average player who's not right-clicking the second they respawn back to their lane. This will actually probably feel fairly similar in terms of your amount of time out of lane. Your total resources lost will not be that different. If you're running Summoner Teleport, you are out of lane for 4 seconds longer, which, by the way, the changes from 1320 were minus 2 seconds of that timer. So this is actually 2 seconds longer than back then. So if you think back to like, what did 1319 feel like, getting a solo kill and they're TPing back to lane, you have 2 seconds beyond what 1319 was to get that lane pushed in and then do everything else. But again, for the non-TP champions, their death timer is 2 seconds longer with a 3 second longer death timer buff, with this thing not falling off the second you spawn, with all these other things. And so again, should feel a lot better because the goals around reducing lane snowballing and let you come back just off of a single death, we still believe in those. We still want you to play your lane out and not have that lane be too snowbally. One avenue for this is certainly death timers and the death guard buff. There are other things we can of course explore as well. So we'll see, right, what it comes down to longer term, split 3, split 1, whatever. But yeah, that's happening. Second, there are some changes to some items that AD carries use. So up first, Doran's Blade is getting a lifesteal and flat HP nerf, 0.5% lifesteal. It changed from Omnivamp to pure lifesteal. Omnivamp, of course, made it a worse fighter item. Lifesteal is something that AD carries almost only use. One thing that's disproportionate around Doran's Blade as well is that top lane and mid lane ADCs spend a lot more time hitting the wave. Bot lane just has bot laners just have less free time to right click the wave because you can get hit back by the Qiyana or Sona or the Senna or whatever, or the enemy AD carry trades back on you. Whereas if you're playing mid lane, like if you watch what top level mid laners play, they're just kind of right clicking the wave back and forth in a lot more cases. And so this is a mid lane skewed sort of change here. Also, if you're thinking about like, hey, what does the average melee top laner do? They don't always get to just right click the wave forever, right? Because they're under threat and they can't just do that forever. So it should be a reasonable impact to drop the lifesteal by some. We could have gone harder. What we'd rather have done was lower the burst resilience of this item. We think this is kind of correct to swing this item relatively hard. Now Doran's Blade has the most consistent damage with plus 10 AD. That's really good. It now has the least flat health given with only plus 80. It has a lot of health sustain. Lifesteal is still more health than like Doran's Ring gives you on health. Yeah, Doran's Shield has more, but you're melee to use Doran's Shield. You're taking damage to play the lane out. So Doran's Blade is saying you're less resilient, but you have some damage. Okay, fine, right? We think that's a reasonable shape for the item, and overall that weakens the class of champions who build Doran's Blade, especially ones who can auto attack a lot and thus use the lifesteal. Also, with having less flat HP, though this will of course affect melee users some. Obviously, they care about health. Having 20 less health on a ranged user can get them into burst thresholds more often, and so I think that's pretty important here. The next one is Blade of the Ruin King. We had nerfed the other 2 best AD carry items last patch in Kraken Slayer and Static Shiv. Those were actually the best items. People just aren't buying Shiv, and they're wrong. Blade of the Ruin King is kind of next in line of like, this is the next greatest item here. And of course, we saw Lucian has now started to take over as the core mid laner. Blade of the Rune King is typically his starting item now. This item is just really over. I mean, we saw with like anyone who was like super bound to Blade of the Rune King. Like we saw Aurelia literally gained win rate, right, when 1410 came out, because yeah, it turns out that, you know, the amount of stats Rune King got for -3% current health on hit damage, the stats were just better, right? And so yeah, we retuned Aurelia, and in this case, we're trying to keep the power level of this item relatively similar for melee. So even though we're taking off 5 AD and 5 attack speed, we're giving back 1% current health on hit damage. This on hit damage does lifesteal, so this is stronger than traditional on hit damage. Like my rubric for the value of on hit damage is that it is 60% as strong as raw AD, because even though it's applied on every auto attack, it's not applied on your spells, and it can't lifesteal and it can't crit. The fact that this does apply on anyone whose spells apply on hits, aka things like Aurelia Q, but also because it works with lifesteal, it's better than traditional on hit damage, and it also scales, which means that like, hey, you know, I got 20 attack damage at level 9. Okay, well I got a, you know, similar amount of on hit damage, but then this goes up further from there, and the 20 attack damage, like if you're not building crit, it's just 20 attack damage, right? Nothing else really multiplies this thing. So this will probably be a slightly weaker item the second you buy it for melee users. It will clearly be a worse item for range users because there's no compensation. But the goal is relatively power neutral. If we need to buff Aurelia, we are happy to. If we need to buff any other champions like Master Yi, we are happy to. That is fine. We can buff them as needed. That's totally okay. But Ruin King is like very clearly like one of the extreme outliers of item power in current League of Legends. And you know, spoiler, these are the kind of items that are getting the biggest nerfs when we're, you know, talking about the split 3 item nerfs. Is there's some items that are just like really, 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 really over every other item, and there's some items that are like sensibly tuned and are never picked because they're not extremely overpowered. On average, items in League are actually relatively balanced, but people just buy the best ones, and so the builds we actually see in game are all kind of overpowered items. Next one is a systems change to Black Cleaver. We are going back on a change that's about 6 or so years old. Black Cleaver had a condition for a while that said it can't apply more than 1 stack in any given frame, in any 100th of a second, which in realistic terms, I believe to our game engine is 1 frame, which is a 30th of a second. I believe, I'm not 100% on that one, but I'm pretty sure. Either way, internally in scripting, it's 0.01 seconds. This means that if you were Senna, your Q and autos did not apply to stacks because the on-hit damage, you know, applied at the same time as your basic attack, and so it never applied. We are going back on this rule and saying, you know what, if your champ is really sick at applying cleaver, good for you, have fun. And this means that, like, you know that Viego passive where it does % current health damage? 2 stacks per hit. Are you buying Blade of the Rune King? 2 stacks per hit. Are you using Shyvana Q? 2 stacks per hit. Unless we segmented that damage, I don't think we did. I don't think Shyvana Q is split apart more than 0 seconds here. But this is led by let's let Senna buy Black Cleaver again. And we're comfortable with this item having strong interaction with champions who have strong interactions with it. Generally speaking, I am a fan of simplifying item rules where possible, and unless we really, really have to say that, no, we need to make this exception for this item for some interesting reason, letting things just work, beneficial to the champion, and then saying like, yes, you're good at Black Cleaver, you will always buy Black Cleaver, that's fine. I think we should be pretty accepting of that. We are, just broadly speaking, we're very accepting of this item is the best item in the game on you. That's fine. Gwen will always buy Nashor's Tooth. That's fine. Like, we don't need to create exceptions to make it not the case. This is just like the item that she wants, and that's totally okay. The biggest call out here is Urgot is going to apply 2 stacks when he shotgun knees you with an auto attack. That will matter some. He will gain some power here. Urgot is probably going to be the biggest win rate gainer because he is the most common Black Cleaver user, and he in fact has an interaction here that matters. But we can tune him around this. This is fine. If Urgot's OP, we can nerf Urgot. Generally speaking, we're happy with items working in an intuitive, simple, easy to understand way, and tuning around that as needed. I think that's fine. If you may have seen the patch preview posted yesterday, we are not nerfing any of the AP items. Though I think, again, a lot of items are globally overpowered, and I think Liandry's, personally, is one of them. Just nerfing some mage items is not the best when really the only mages that are really great from what we can tell are basically jungle ones. That really means we should just keep retuning the AP junglers. That, like, Faded Ashes is doing what we want it to do, and we should tune champions around the item. And Landry's Torment, I do believe, is overpowered, but, like, mages as a whole class aren't. And so, yeah, we could bring down the best mage items, but like, not before we bring down the best AD carry items, and not before, like, it's like the whole house of cards, right, matters, because classes of champion are balanced relative to other classes of champions. For example, if you want to look at like solo queue win rates, and you want to like measure the value of the Kraken Slayer nerf from last patch, Tristana mid lost 2% win rate. Tristana bot did not lose 2% win rate because she's facing other Kraken Slayer users. Unsurprising, of course, right? But like, you know, that this is what happens. It's like, well, if we nerf Leandries, we just nerf mages, when mages on average, like across League of Legends, are probably not actually weak, or like actually overpowered right now, right? So this means that we need to do individual changes to individual champions when their clears are too fast, and we think their clear speeds are unreasonable, or if we think something else is unreasonable, we can again retune as needed, and that's fine. Anyway, that's why there's no AP item nerfs here. Let's now move on to some large adjustments to individual champions. So up first are a set of adjustments to Qiyana. So Qiyana was something I had wanted to do sometime last week. She didn't make the cut off of our Monday meeting for reactive balance, but I got ahead on my work, and so I spent some time today on Tuesday being like, hey, do we want to do some Qiyana changes? I think I want to do some Qiyana changes. People were really receptive internally to like, yes, let's do changes that look kind of like this, and spend some time getting the right set of changes. And so here we are. So broadly speaking, two things with Qiyana, actually more than two. Okay. So Qiyana is currently, if you look at win rates, very elite skewed. Okay, fine. If you look at her like win rate with game time data, she's very late game skewed. Those don't tend to coincide, but sometimes they do. That late game champions can be elite skewed because of whatever reason. Now, the cool thing that I have access to that's a lot harder for players to get with public data is slicing win rate by champion mastery. So Qiyana is one of the harder to play champions in the game. It takes 300 to 400 games to flatten out the mastery curve to where you can't really measure any more gains after about 350. I forget exactly where it was, but it was like clearly more than 160 or so, and it stopped around 300 to 500. I don't remember exactly. I just remember it was like, oh, she's one of the deeper mastery curves, right? There's plenty of champs that stop at like 40 games, for example. Malphite, Misfortune, things like that. Or they tend to. Qiyana is very clearly a deep champion that requires a lot of mastery. And if you look at like just show me players with like 200 to 300 games in the champion, the low elo win rate and the high elo win rate look really similar. It's like within 1% at like 200 games, and it's like within like it's statistically insignificant at like 400 games. But if you look at like, hey, we're first timing it, or I like can't even flash my mastery emote yet, we're like my first 15 games in the champion. For high elo, this is like a 46% win rate champion, and for low elo, it's like a 44% win rate champion. She's not the lowest in the game. Rengar, and then second place is Azir for the worst champions to play for your first time in League of Legends. Rengar's number 1, Azir's number 2. But Qiyana's up there, right? Qiyana's quite low. And this is, again, more pronounced in low elo. So it seems to indicate that either low elo players are less exposed to Qiyana, or like whatever reason exactly. It's hard to tease out all the exact causes, but basically the mastery curve starts out lower for low elo players and starts out higher for high elo players, but it reaches the same point. Like at you know, so it's quite interesting, right? So what that means is people who are good at Qiyana are actually like roughly appropriately powerful. Like the actual power level of Qiyana at game 300 is like pretty appropriate to other champions at game 300. The problem is there's not a lot of mains in low elo. Like the relative share of players who are inexperienced at Qiyana is much higher in low elo. Now, that's true for many other champions as well, but Qiyana specifically has a really, really low performance level at her floor. And we might not have a good way to solve that. We don't necessarily need to. Now, to be clear, not trying to make this champion less skill across at the top end. Like the things you can do when you're a really good Qiyana player, not trying to erode that, not trying to make mastery not matter. I think we could probably find ways to raise the floor. And then obviously like this technically means that like instead of a newbie being at like 45, they're at 47, but like still putting that top end player 53, right? And being like, well, I have this level of power, I'm going to be this good. And technically this means there's only 7% of win rate to gain instead of 9% of win rate to gain, which like you could argue makes champion easier, I guess. And again, this is not really meant to be that here. I'm just saying, like, thinking out loud about Qiyana, about this champion, about her shape, about how skilled she is, how hard she is, like, what's appropriate here. We can maybe find room to bring up the floor somewhere. Anyway, but what this means, though, is that Qiyana is not, like, innately really elite skewed. That like a combination of power curve and actual champion outputs means that if you're good, there's not a really big difference by MMR. It's just simply low elo players aren't good at Qiyana on average, right? Compared to higher elo players. Okay, so the goal is not to give Qiyana much power. Now, we do think it's going to be power positive a little bit, and for now, that's fine. She has an incredibly low ban rate for an assassin. She's also relatively low pick rate. Qiyana's depth right now, like for those who play Qiyana, the amount that they play Qiyana is relatively high across her history. There have been times where she was even more deeply played, but like not much. She's generally in a pretty good state depth-wise. That the Qiyana mains who are Qiyana mains are doing pretty well on her, and they're still playing her. And again, her power level when actually mained is completely reasonable and appropriate for other champions that are at her mastery level. However, she is at one of her narrowest player bases of all time. We are currently one of the narrowest states for Qiyana, where very, very, very few players are trying to play Qiyana. Those who do still main her a fair bit and more than the average champion, and again, relatively high for her history as well, but she's at her incredibly, like she's at one of her narrowest points. So that's fine. Like generally speaking, a narrow, deeply played champion is something that we're like, that's fine. This is a champion who has a player base, who likes playing her, who sticks with her. This is not like require adjustments necessarily, but I still wanted to do it. One, because I promised that we were going to look at all the assassins, and I missed Qiyana. I don't know how I missed Qiyana, but I did. I missed Qiyana last time we were looking at like how are these champions doing? Are they good at early game? Are they not? Can these champions kill you? And yeah, Qiyana doesn't really have. She has a very bad early game right now. Some of that was intentional because it meant that it was a way to fix elo skew on the champion, right? That like her observed win rate in Masters versus Silver is like I think it's like 6% off. It's like really far, which like we can be okay with that. Or we can say, actually, you know, last time she was really elite skewed, right? Like we were in a state where back in 2019 as well as 2021, I think, were the last two times Qiyana was in the pro meta. Those were times where she actually had both breadth and depth. Now, she might have been like way too overpowered in elite level solo queue. I don't remember her like ban rates back then. I just don't remember. I could find it. It wouldn't be hard. I just like didn't look. But anyway, the thought is I think we can give her a little bit more agency during the early game. I think we can also give her more burst damage that she plays like an assassin a bit more often. I guess asterisk around the burst damage point because we're taking some away as well. But again, if we can give her more agency in lane, she'll probably be a little bit more broadly appealing because you can pick up and play Qiyana and you're like, oh, I understand these tools. They're reliable. I can do things with them. And then there's the mastery curve, right? Then there's the mastery like growth journey. Okay, a lot of time spent. What are we doing to Qiyana? Okay, we are buffing her base armor by 3. We are buffing the base damage on Q at ranks 1 and 2, nerfing it very slightly at ranks 4 and 5, buffing the AD ratio by a lot. As long as you're at like 50 bonus AD, it's not even 50. Actually, it's around 50 bonus AD. As long as you're around like 50 bonus AD by level 9, this is a buff in literally all cases. I mean, it's strictly a buff levels 1 through 6, and then based on your bonus AD, you know, level 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, whatever, and then at a certain point you have enough bonus AD where it's like Q is clearly stronger. So basically her armor is always better, which means that she is more resilient in lane when getting right clicked, getting, you know, hit by people. I'm increasingly trying to give melee champions, especially mid lane melee champions, good base armor. This probably means that at certain points you have to like start nerfing armor growth to make them not immune to assassins, but give them a decent amount of base armor so that they can thrive in like high elo games where players actually right click you. Like if you watch a silver Orianna versus silver Yasuo's shield like doesn't get popped, doesn't get auto attacked, and you watch like Chovy play that matchup and Yasuo's not allowed to last hit. And one way to bridge that gap between, you know, high elo, obviously like everything else also scales up, right? Like players get better as well, but it's like, you know, part of why we have auto attackers taking over the mid lane metagame right now is really, really good players are way better auto you for every CS, and bad players or non-pros or everyone else in the world are really, really bad at auto you for every CS. And so unsurprisingly, if we're ever in a world where base armor is low, like early lane anti-auto attack defenses are low, like if a Warden's Mail isn't a good item, for example, or you can't buy it because why the hell would you buy Warden's Mail and not a tank? And even then, you would rather have Sunfire Cape, I'm pretty sure, so you'd get a Bomby Cinder. But like if armor's low and regen's low and all these other things are low, it's like, oh, auto attacks crush you. And the tough thing about having a bunch of regen automatically is, oh, I before I can push you out. Like the annoyance of like, why bother pressing Syndra Q on you? You're just going to regen it. And so it's like, you can't like one size fits all with regen. I'm pretty sure you need armor. And then, of course, if their armor is high, you have to make sure that like Yasuo and Talon and co have the correct amount of damage to fight Qiyana, but also not one-shot Orianna. And there's a whole circle of, things going on here. We're spending a lot of time on prefaces again. But I believe in general that for melee champions, we need to give them enough armor to feel good, or like remotely resilient to getting auto-attacked in lane. Generally speaking, the way I feel here. So plus armor on Qiyana, which will also affect her jungle clear because she's always getting hit constantly by physical damage while in the jungle. Again, bunch of base damage on Q. We're also, I didn't include it here, but we're also adding more to the monster mod on Q. Now it's already quite high, but we already had the lever here. And things like bumping the attack speed on W is something that we could have done, but that is extremely elite skewed because it says, oh, Qiyana, you have specifically wave management power instead of like all-in threat power or like poke resilience or whatever. It's like giving specifically wave management power is extremely, extremely elite skewed and not on the short list of things that we should give Qiyana, as opposed to like making her threatening, and actually able to play out champion combat. I think on average, assassins need to wait at most for level 6 in order to feel like they can play their lane out in a PvP scenario. Like if you're a Kali and you have to wait till 6, that's fine. But in some cases, being able to play at 3 or 4, much more desirable. All right, so anyway, Qiyana getting some Q buffs, getting some Q monster buffs, getting some armor. We expect these to be outsized buffs towards jungle, but of course, these are obviously like strictly more powerful for mid lane as well. As compensation, we are nerfing W damage on the rank up. Now, actual damage from W is not strongly MMR skewed. That said, specifically auto-attacking is. Qiyana's level of auto-attack damage is extremely elite skewed. Even as a melee champion, elite players are way better auto-attacking. This tends to be true for almost every champion in the game. It's certainly true for Qiyana here. This might mean we want to actually lower Qiyana's auto-attack damage and let her rely more on spells as a way to unwind elite skew even beyond what we get out of champion mastery, and like the kit would be natively very lightly normal skewed, but champ mastery makes up for it or whatever, so it allow us to tune her to different numbers or whatever, right? So allow us to give her more power, and maybe she shows up in pro, I'm not sure. But also removing some damage from R via the AD ratio here. So we're taking away some AD ratio on R, we're giving it back on Q. Now on average, you're going to cast way more Qs than Rs, so Q is going up by 0.15 and R is going down by 0.45, I think. So as long as you press 3 Qs per R, this is a buff, right? Like ratio for ratio. But certainly, like if you're going to just pure one shot with R, that's going to be weaker. Now I know that R tends to be a like power per ulti does tend to be a pretty pro skewed thing. But in this case, I think it's worth doing because even though it would be nice to get Qiyana in pro, I don't think we're close to doing it anyway. And I kind of want to do what's correct for the champion, which is play up her bread and butter skills and let these feel good and satisfying and powerful. And yeah, she's going to like hard one-shot you a little bit less with R, and that's fine. I think it's okay to make her like slightly less ult reliant and not just hard one-shot you if ult lands against a wall, whatever. So this is the changes here, right? This is the sort of reshape. It's a lot more laning phase prowess. It's a monster mod to see if we can get Qiyana jungle to exist. That'd be cool if it did. And some power off elsewhere to pay for giving her more of a say in her laning phase. We expect her to still be a scaling pick. That's fine. There are a lot of changes to Senna. There was a lot here. This actually spawned a few weeks ago as an acknowledgement that... So here's the tough thing, right? Is if players were more willing to like pick optimally, Senna would be really, really good in solo queue. Like if AD carry players were like, hey, I see you're hovering Nautilus. Do you want to take a Dorn shield? I'll play Senna and buy Relic Shield, and like we'll just play Senna Nautilus. I'm the AD carry. I'm still playing a Markswoman. You're a support. You're still playing a tank, but you can last hit instead of me. But people aren't doing that in solo queue. Senna's matchups, when you look at solo queue tables, are just entirely alongside other AD carries. And her best teammates are mages and tanks, and it's really, really, really not close. And what has happened over time is we have eroded, through good intentions to be clear, we have eroded Senna's ability to play well with AD carries, and all that's left is her ability to play well with tanks. And in pro play, where they play her with tanks, she is a very normal, like 35% presence bot laner, which is like very appropriate. That is an appropriately balanced champion with a healthy amount of pro presence. Good job, she's in there. But the tough thing is if you're a Senna support player, she's bad for like 95% of your solo queue games because you're playing alongside Zeri or Lucian or Kalista or whatever, and those matchups are all really bad for you. And if you're an AD carry player, and by the way, Senna is a very popular support. I think she's like top 4 pick rate in most elos. I haven't checked this recently, but she used to be. In a large portion of your games, you're playing with a bad support who's pro-jailed because none of you want to seem to change your champ select. And this is like, I'm not trying to blame players. It's just clear players don't want to do this. But she's currently balanced around her best pairings. 30% presence in pro. Clearly a balanced champion, right? When they're willing to comp around her. So the point here is to be like, well, we're not going to change player behavior, so let's change some strengths and weaknesses around Senna. So what this is that Senna is going to be much, much worse as the primary AD carry on the team. Now, over time, her attack speed ratio has doubled from her release, which means though her attack speed growth here is being halved from 4% to 2%, the like functional attack speed gain level over level is identical to where it was back when she launched. The only difference is the value of getting bonus attack speed through a stat shard or Berserker's Greaves or a rapid fire cannon or whatever, Kraken Slayer, Blade of the Rune King, you name it. Those are all better because, well, the ratio's better and the competing bonus AS from levels has gone down. So, hey, it slightly opens up some attack speed builds. Instead of having a, honestly, pretty good amount of attack speed on a lethality build, she is going to feel slower. She's going to be as slow as when she launched. Which, to me, like, if we're not going below that, I think that's reasonable. This basically just makes good to her attack speeds when she launched, when she was a very popular champion. We're also lowering the amount of bonus crit chance given per every 20 souls. Now, this is an unclean number. This will slightly miss 25% crit breakpoints. And by the way, I did not want to do like 8.3334% crit chance. We could have, I chose not to, but that would have said every 60 souls you get a full crit and with a crit chance. But at the end of the day, Senna cleanly turns overcapped crit chance into lifesteal. And so the amount of like crit chance she gets from this, it doesn't really matter that it's like unclean or whatever, because if she has 100% crit chance, she just turns it into lifesteal. Now she's going to feel sometimes bad about having like 94% crit chance. I mean, yeah, but like then you get 20 souls. Like in the prior chance, you would have felt bad at 91.3 or whatever, and then, you know, gets the next soul. And then it's like, no matter what you do, there's going to be some breakpoint where she doesn't have 100% crit. That's just going to happen. That's fine. But because we have fully alleviated Senna's crit damage ratio nerf that she had way back when she launched, the way the math actually works out is the total amount of like functional crit damage EV per soul is very similar to what it's been in the past. Like, we're not at the highest, or like we're currently at the highest, but we're going to not anywhere near the lowest her functional crit damage per soul has gone. When she launched, it was much, much lower. And so we could have, of course, reintroduced the crit damage penalty instead. I chose crit chance per soul because this says that her crit damage works normally, and it's just one fewer rule you have to learn. Do you have to learn 8% crit chance? No. Do you have to learn how much range she gets on every, 20 breakpoint? No. Do you have to learn how much AD she gets? No. It doesn't really matter. But just knowing, oh, I have one fewer rule around, oh yeah, my crits are worth because it says so. I like cleaning this up when we can, when it's all the same mathematically. This also has the impact of doing this instead of like minus crit damage of if you want to buy crit chance, if you want to earn pure gold, it's there for you. Now, we know that farming ADC Senna is not a popular role for her. It's been like 10% of her plays, even when she was obscenely overpowered when her interaction with relic shield stacks was bugged. But like, it's there, and 10% of the roll rate of a very popular champion is still a relatively popular champion. So these have the effect of disproportionately less nerfing the Sennas who directly earn gold, or those who are doing well while playing support. While they, of course, very directly lower just how much damage she gains by building pure lethality and being essentially a full AD carry anyway. So Senna is going to be much worse as your primary damage source if all you're doing is getting souls and getting levels. If you're gaining gold, the relative value of gold is actually increased, but no golden multipliers have been destroyed really at all, not any direct way. Of course, that's a nerf. That's a very meaningful nerf, and so we should buff this champion. This is more power neutral. So this was added. I actually went back and like read the patch note that like the designer wrote when this was done, and it was this. Senna got a lethality ratio on Q back when she was doing Iceborne Gauntlet tank builds. Tank Senna has very poor gameplay. And if we get back to the point of Tank Senna and it becomes our common build, we will have to kill it with fire, we will have to lower some base values, and play up some AD ratios, some AP ratios, some lethality ratios, something. Tank Senna is, I'm pretty sure, unacceptable. That said, I don't think we're there right now, and so let's try, right? Let's try alleviating it. So the lethality ratio is gone from the heal. In its place, the base value at ranks 2 through 5 is going up. The AD ratio and the AP ratio substantially are going up as well. I mathed this to like ballpark soul count plus going to 2 items, going to opportunity plus Edge of Night is her most common 2-item build, and it was pretty much the same. Again, counting for souls because souls feed into the bonus AD ratio, and of course counting for the flat value going up to rank 5, and it's like pretty similar. And then there's pure upside afterwards because usually her items after Edge of Night were not lethality. It was she would go for LDR or RFC, or she would occasionally sell for a Wardstone or buy a Zephyr or something. And it's like, well, in all these cases, then it's more upside. So Senna is probably gaining a little bit of win rate off of this change. This also says that she has more options than just going pure lethality. She probably still will. There's still very good items on her, but she might be more likely to try things like Black Cleaver, which got buffed this patch, especially for her, because she's going to apply 2 stacks every auto now, and every Q as well, which is a very big deal. We are also buffing the AD and AP ratio on the slow on Q. This will not buff her laning phase very much. It's still a 15% slow at level 1, basically. But as she gains more souls, more slow. As she gains more attack damage from souls or buying items, more slow. So this has a nice thing of being like, well, you're not getting this if you're playing Tank Senna. But hey, if you're building any sort of regular offensive item, congratulations, you're getting a stronger slow on your Q. And you'll notice a recurring trend here. We are playing up Senna's utility, right? She's literally losing DPS. And there's no way she's not having less damage than before. This is just going to be true. She is going to be a lower damage champion next patch, and she can't get around that. What she's getting is, on average, more healing on Q. Literally always more slow on Q. Literally always an extra quarter second on the root on W. And it's not very much, but it's plus 20 at rank 1, which is almost the entire game for her. Plus 20 base shield on R. Now, the shield is weird because it has a really, really strong soul scalar ratio of 1.5, which is a lot, right? It's the same as having a 2.0 AD ratio. That doesn't work for items, right? So it's like, my Q has like a 0.4 AD ratio and souls feed into it. This is 5 times that, except the items don't do anything, right? So like the shield's rank up is like a little fake. It's mostly cooldown at this point and some damage. Really, the shield is getting scaled by souls primarily, but it's like, well, the shield's been high before, we can buff it. And one thing you're also probably noticing is, wait, there's a bunch of AP ratio buffs. What's going on here? So the goal, and if we get it wrong, we will retune it. The goal is to give Senna the opportunity to play enchanter-heavy AP builds if she wants. Now, right now, all that's really happening is for most of her skills that has an AD and an AP ratio, the AP ratio is double the AD ratio. Even though, of course, ability power is cheaper than attack damage. Attack damage gives you attack damage. You can right-click people. Ability power has no intrinsic value. It can only make spells stronger. And considering how far off we are from being able to build Ardent Sensor or any other AP item, it's like, okay, let's swing really, really hard. If we get it wrong, we can always retune it. That's fine. But if we're in a world where Senna kind of likes Ardent Sensor because she gets the attack speed on hit damage too, that's fine. If it's literally always best in slot and she can't pick anything else other than that, we've probably overtuned it. We need to walk it back some. But if we get into a world where she's allowed to build AP, that's fine. This has always been something we've been willing to entertain because it will meaningfully change her outputs. It's saying that you are auto-attacking to get your souls. You're auto-attacking in order to apply that move speed buff to yourself. You're auto-attacking because it refreshes your Q. But what you're really doing with your spells is getting, really fat heals. You're getting a really fat slow. You're getting a really fat shield. And that's what you're getting out of this. And you're doing AP, a little bit of attack speed, some ability haste, and that's what your build is doing. That seems reasonable, right? That is a more unique, a different set of output, and a set of outputs that we're pretty happy with. So that's the point here, the overall point here, right? And then again, we can say like, hey, by the way, Cleaver works. That the hope is that Senna has a lot more supportive builds, specifically one that work with ADCs in her lane, because that is all that solo queue players run into. This is specifically to bridge the gap between solo queue Senna and pro Senna, and I don't think we've fully bridged the gap, but these were changes that I was confident in, that we could ship, that I could spend my time thinking elsewhere, and it's like, look, if we bridge half the gap, at least we get closer. Like, that's still a good thing. Even if there's like something with 10 times the effort that's twice as good, doing a lot of things to get us halfway there for relatively low effort is a positive and makes the game better without having to spend too much time on individual change, which I think is generally positive. Though of course we still want to have, spend a lot of care on what we're doing. Alrighty. We then move on to just smaller changes overall. So first up is Azir. I've been meaning to make these changes for a long time. Just haven't had the space to do them. I did the last few sets of Azir nerfs, and what I tried to do was incredibly lower his health regen. Because this is a champion who is running Fleet Footwork, who can now run Absorb Life, who was running Grasp, and was really unassailable in lane. He had so much regen that, it felt like, oh, he's actually still a good laner again, the thing that pros always just do with Azir. And so I nerfed his regen a lot. And when we did the update to him, I forget all the details, but I know his current armor is on the low end for a ranged champion. And so my belief is, as long as these champions aren't in immediate threat of taking over bot lane, they're not Ziggs, they're not Swain, they're not Karthus, basically, are the big three that actually get played, Seraphine, I guess. That, if they're not one of the champions that threaten to take over bot lane, anytime the AD carry items aren't extremely overpowered, then, yeah, if we're not in that world, then, hey, wouldn't it be nice if we, gave these champions enough armor to, feel like they can exist. So in general, HP 5, to center in on it, nerfing Azir's health regen had very, very little impact in his pro presence. The total result of nerfing Azir's health regen was around 2% of win rate. Azir is currently, so Azir right before Worlds, in 0.18 or whatever, Azir, when we made him work with Nashor's Tooth and then did the follow-up balance update on his W, to bring the base damage back up a little bit. That patch, Azir was 48 to 49% win rate in every MMR bracket, and because we had unskewed him so much from the changes back in 13.6 and 13.10, that Azir was balanced at all solo queue brackets at 48% for sub Emerald. And if you go and look at what does 300 games of mastery look like for Azir, it was in line with other champions in the game. And so we had a time where we had a 48% win rate. It was 48% win rate in low MR and 49% win rate in D2 plus. We had 1% elo skew between sub Emerald and D2 plus. And that was the appropriate win rate for the champion based on champion mastery. We are 2 to 2.5% win rate below those numbers now. Even if you look at really, really high elo, if you look at Masters plus Azir, it's still sub 50, by the way. And so Azir is actually in a really, really weak spot. He's weaker than he's supposed to be on solo queue power level. Now, we know that pros like playing Azir. We also know that nerfing his HP 5 really, really hurt his solo queue performance and did not meaningfully affect his pro presence. We saw him at Worlds. We saw him at MSI. We nerfed his health regen a second time in front of MSI. We still saw him at MSI. The only reason we're not seeing him now is because he's facing a bunch of AD carries, and people would rather just play AD carries right now in mid lane. So we managed to nerf Azir from balanced to 2% underpowered to 2.5% underpowered, and he's still in pro. What this means is HP 5 was a very bad lever. And so I've been meaning to revert this when I had time to do so, and I had it was the right environment for it, because unsurprisingly Azir was still in pro play a whole bunch. The other change is giving him some base armor. Now I don't think we can go extreme here, but it's going up to 25, which I think is, so 25 is the 25th percentile of armor, which is roughly just the median ranged champion armor in League of Legends. I think on average, Azir having average ranged champion armor at level 1 is fine, is reasonable, is totally okay, is totally acceptable. We can give him this. Also, in most metagames, in pro play, Azir faces magic damage. Of course, right now he faces physical damage, so if Azir happens to be a really good counter to the current meta, great. If you look at Grandmaster only, Grandmaster to Challenger, Azir's four most common matchups are in fact AD carries. If you look at, again, even Masters Plus, it's a bunch of mages again. And some Zed and Yasuo too, but it's much more normal. But it's oh, wow, this happens to be extemporaneously really good in the current pro and elite level matchmaking environment to give him a bunch of armor against his typical lane opponents. But also longer term, we can probably have Azir be in a good spot for solo queue and not 80% presence in pro by having average range champion base armor, good HP 5, and then find some other nerf to make him not auto push lanes forever. This could be W cost, this could be W cooldown, this could be W damage, I don't know, but like we can find some other way to say, yeah, a 0 AC scaling champion, he doesn't have a really good laning phase, acknowledged, but not make him just like a piece of paper in lane, because pros were still getting around that, and solo queue players weren't, based on, again, win rates and pro presence. So we could go a little bit harder here on things like the regen. Right now, it didn't, but we could bump his regen a little more if we wanted to. We could do a couple other things, but that would be going into adjustment territory of giving him enough regen that we can take away some damage and whatnot, and we probably will at some point, but yeah, regen was clearly not the correct nerf. Glad we're getting rid of that now, or at least reverting a good portion of it, and giving him some armor to make him, I think, a more functional champion. Simple buff to Orianna, buffing the Q AP ratio. Not much to say here, just giving her some more laning phase. Simple Orianna buff. We think she has a little bit of room in solo queue, and so we're going to give her a small buff. Syndra is getting a little bit of flat damage on R. This is a flat 10 damage per Dark Sphere. So it's kind of front loaded towards level 6, of course. But even then, it's she gains ability haste on Q based on R rank. She gets ability haste just by leveling up overall. So the number of Dark Spheres she's casting per R is just going to increase late game as well. So even though it's flat 10, it's also more than that late game. In actual practice. And overall, it's just picking like, hey, Syndra is a beat weaker than supposed to be. Trying to give her close to a 50% win rate because that's pretty reasonable with this champion. Like, she's not that difficult. And if we see her in pro, that's cool. If she shakes the pro meta, that's cool. But yeah, we can play at her strategic niche of I have an R, it one-shots you. She's good against squishies. I know there is a pretty strong undercurrent of the game feels too lethal and there seems to be too much damage. Making burst mages non-functional should not, making burst mages functional should not get interrupted just because, yes, damage is a little bit too high in League of Legends right now. This is why we're seeing some item nerfs. It's why we're going to lower the amount of gold in the game to some degree. We're going to try to find other ways to bring damage in appropriate ways down. But we should still have functional burst mages. We should still have functional assassins. It's the other classes that are too bursty that we need to deal with. How bursty are marksmen and things like Krakus there? How bursty are fighters? The shapes of their items correct and whatnot. Are tanks appropriately tanky? Are tanks even worth grabbing? Like, a lot of our tanks are pretty low win rate. Spoiler, I think their items are really bad. So anyway, yes, we can give Senna some power. Sylas was hit more than we wanted. Now, to be fair, Sylas was probably about 1% overpowered last patch, and he's probably about 1 to 1.5% underpowered this patch. Now, there is some build opposition to go. If you look at Masters plus Sylas players, they've pretty heavily shifted their first item. Before, it was all Lichbane or Ludens. Immediately Ludens has fallen off, and there's a lot of people are trying Roa, they're trying Rocket Belt. I think there's another item they're trying out as well that's relatively common. Cosmic Drive, second slot, shot up from the 7th most built item in slot 2 to the 2nd most built item in slot 2. Of course, Rocket Belt and Cosmic were directly buffed as well. We actually did expect that Sylas would gain some win rate off of players adapting to builds over time. But generally speaking, I think it is correct to tune for the game that players are playing, and then as they optimize, we can then tune them down when they're actually performing too well. This is the same thing as we could nerf Tarek. We know his win rate's really high. We know he's kind of free low, but until players identify that he's free low, kind of like Maokai last year, until players identify this champion as free low, it just looks like we know what we're doing when we nerf them because no one else understands. So Sylas probably has some very good builds that makes the champion not actually weak. That said, for now, we're going to give him about 1.25% of win rate. We're giving him some base HP. He's now going up to kind of bottom of the barrel melee champion health of 600. That's still fairly low. I think Sylas could get more base health and more base armor to make him more resilient in lane. This allows him to be a little more resilient. He is melee after all. His only healing access is if he reaches the enemy champion, which means they either let you walk at them or he lands E. And so the more resilient Sylas is, the less he has to one-shot you to do his job. Sylas right now, statistically, is 5th highest deaths per game for mid laners. He's also very high in kills per game as well, but Sylas is still, at least on current, including low elo builds where they haven't adapted to the current better items, which again is a real thing and will happen over time. He is currently still Ballistic Missile, but part of the changes were to make him shift builds, and that just will take time for players to do this. Across elo brackets, it's more it's already more true in higher MR brackets, but again, will take time. Regardless, some base health. The other changes are a buff to the single target AP ratio on the passive and a little bit of base damage on W. The point here is to give this to damage, to give him damage. We took some damage away, and so we're kind of putting it back in different places, which, okay, is reasonable. is because ultimately we did take away more power than we wanted to, so okay, some damage back is fine. Is to say, hey, if it's in the passive AP ratio, this requires you to auto attack 3 times. So it requires you to play out a slightly longer combat pattern where you're not just hitting once and instantly dying. W has a low cooldown and is frequently maxed first. The vast majority of players max it first. It's like a 6-second cooldown, which means that it's much more likely to get value out of this when maxed and when you will live long enough to get a second W off, because the desire to live long enough for a second W with a higher base damage in this particular case says that, okay, yeah, durability and staying alive in whatever manner available means I can get a second W, which is more damage, which is also another passive. So, right, logically this all flows like what's going on here. And in terms of what makes sense for the champion, what helps shape him towards being a functional melee champion. I still believe. I mean, I'd have to wait to see more players switch builds over to see if it really feels like this champion can thrive in melee range. Maybe he still can't just yet. I know that's why initially his E1 had a shield that had a problem making him way too safe in lane. Turns out a back after the shield is really, really good. So you may have to find some other tactics to make him feel really resilient in team fights overall. This might be that, the base heal on the W is increased and it only 1.5x's when low or something. So that he on average heals more and it's okay to heal early because you're going to get most of the value. Like, these are all things that we could consider doing and trying to find out and whatnot. Again, these are just like ideas out loud. Not saying we're going to do any of them, but I really want to make sure that Silas is going to be functional. Is going to feel functional playing in melee in a fight, right? Maybe not a 5v5, but like should feel functional like a 3-on-3. Because it's always hard to be melee in a 5-on-5, right? There's marks running around doing a lot of damage. We are making some adjustments to Katarina. We are strictly buffing the rank up and AP ratio on Q. We are nerfing the rank up on E, and we are nerfing the on hit ratio of R. The goal here is to buff AP Katarina. And bridge or close the gap between Qmax and Emax. The 3 most common skill orders for Katarina are normal Qmax, which is her most common by far and one of the worst performing. Her second most common is instantly Emax. And the third most common is 3 points Q into fully Emax. Now, obviously, any player who does atypical skill orders is more likely to be a main, and so these win rate deltas, they're very large. They're like 5 to 7%. That is not just because the power of rank 5E is 7% win rate higher than the power of rank 5Q, but it does indicate that Katarina mains have discovered that it's really, really not worth ranking up Q. That kind of sucks. And so trying to bring up the value of ranking Q, trying to bring down the value of ranking E so that at least it's competitive, and not just always correct to max E, because yeah, it just sucks when your Q rank up, which just looks like it's supposed to be your primary skill, the rank up's actually bad, and you're baiting yourself by maxing it. That's never a good thing. Not all champs need to have everything be equally viable maxed, but it's generally positive if you have a way to be skill expressive and choose based on game state. That's interesting. And it's even more important than that is that the intuitive max is the best max. If like it was ever correct for Wukong to max decoy first, we just should never have that be true. It's okay if decoy is competitive with E for your second max, but it should never be like very obviously correct first, and it shouldn't even be like really clearly better than E, because no one will ever intuit that to be the case. And so like it's worth kind of having that be there and not have like this weird like amount of win rate left on the table, because the correct choice is the unintuitive choice. Not that you can't have not that you can't have optimizations, but the optimizations should at least be intuitive and make sense and be reliable here. Okay, so direct nerf here to E, 2 direct buffs to Q, and then a nerf to the R as well. Some of this is we are again buffing the on hit damage of Blade of the Rune King, and so the consideration is that Katarina might be over buffed with this. Even though Bork's stats are going down, there's still a pretty meaningful concern here. The other is this helps her rely less on hit items. Now, I think ultimately Katarina having viable auto attack builds, which is either like building AD items like Blade of the Rune King, Kraken Slayer, or her like building an Asher's Tooth. She holds 2 daggers. Her hitting you with the daggers, not unreasonable for the champion, right? Not unreasonable that she can have builds where auto attacking is viable. That is fine. Now, it is clearly basically she has to build on hit, which means the differences here are too far off. I think it would be great if she had very viable pure assassin builds, like Lichbane Shadowflame, let's go. Yes, that should be at least as good as any of her on-hit builds. On-hit builds being viable alternatives, cool. On-hit builds being the only thing she can build, not as cool. She is, on a surface level, an assassin. She should be able to build assassin items and feel like an assassin. This also allows her counterplay to be a little bit nicer, because it's not just jump on you and right click for a while, haha. It's, nah, you can play around my stuff, you care about silencing my R, you care about where the daggers are and all these things. Like, the gameplay gets richer when she cares about her spells a lot more. So the goal is, I mean, the funny thing is, like, on net, like, power neutral, because the current best Katarina builds aren't actually weak. But the current best Katarina builds are not ones that Katarina mains seem to like, and they're the less popular ones, which, again, reinforces point A. So trying to bring up AP Katarina and let her feel good being an AP champion. We are bringing up some damage on Vi. So Vi, I know we've seen this champion pro play before, and she currently has a 30% presence in pro play, which, yeah, is not actually too high by any means. But though we aren't nerfing any of the AP junglers this patch, we are buffing several of the common fighter junglers. Right now, the pro jungle meta is tanks in Sejuani and Maokai, and then a bunch of AP fast clear champions. So bringing up some of the fighters seems like free real estate, especially the fighters who have room in solo queue. There's plenty of fighters who are at appropriate win rates. We could buff Lee Sin, but Lee Sin's win rate is pretty appropriate. We could buff Xin Zhao, but we think right now, and maybe we'll change our minds at some point, that Xin Zhao's win rates are pretty appropriate. We could buff Jarvan, but we think right now that Jarvan's win rates are pretty appropriate. And maybe Jarvan and Xin Zhao are supposed to be 51 and not like 50.2. But for now, we're comfortable with them at 50.2. Vi is at like 48 and change. Vi is clearly a weak champion for someone who's relatively straightforward. Vi is probably supposed to be pretty close to about 50. I know she's not like giga straightforward, but like she's not exactly hard. Q is not a really hard pattern to get around, and like, the normal gameplay pattern is pretty straightforward here. Like Viego is more difficult. Rek'Sai is clearly more difficult. Bel'Veth clearly more difficult, right? Like there's probably a long enough list of difficult champions that Vi is maybe supposed to be like 50.5, maybe she's supposed to be 51, but she's 48.5. Vi is weak in solo queue. We will also see pros play her more, but we're buffing her because she is weak in solo queue. This is pretty simple. It's 5 minimum, 10 maximum damage on Q, flat across all ranks. It's a relatively small hit, but it gives her more selfish burst power. In general, selfish power for junglers tends to be very solo queue skewed, and team-wide power for junglers tend to be really pro skewed. This is part of why pros play a lot of tanks. Is like we have these champions like Maokai and Sejuani who have currently quite bad solo queue win rates, but because they're selfless, they're really good in pro, because you can just play low econ and play for your team. We managed to somehow flip the script to where you can play power clear AP junglers and play high econ, but it's only for the ones who have really, really fast clears and thus have so much map up time that they can do other things with it. But usually the fighters that we tended to see actually get played in pro were champions like Vi and Wukong, where you could get no gold income and just R people and be full value. The more that Vi has selfish 1v1 power, the better Vi is going to be in solo queue. And so the hope is to solo queue skew the buffs. We know pros will pick Vi more, because of course they will. They're already picking her some, but it's why we're picking selfish 1v1 power for champions like this. Skarner. Skarner's in a pretty weak state. It turns out that backwards E is a lot of top lane power. Last patch lowered Skarner's top lane win rate and raised his jungle win rate. Now the funny thing is, I'm actually pretty sure we're in a place with Skarner where we are kind of with champions like Qiyana or Azir or even Cassante. Skarner is actually pretty hard to play. Still, like even on like fairly recent mastery data from the last patch or two, he has one of the sharpest looking, steepest looking mastery curves in League of Legends. A lot of Skarner's visibly low win rate is people who aren't very good at Skarner right now. That said, Skarner is incredibly unpopular. He looks non-viable. So we still have to treat Skarner like a new champion, which means his win rates, now that he's been in the game for more than 3 weeks, need to look relatively close to 50%. And so even though Skarner is probably, I think, probably not actually weak in jungle, nobody thinks he's good, and perception is reality, right? It doesn't really matter the technical power level of every champ in the game. What matters is that players have fun and feel like there are viable options to play, and that that, not only do they have viable options to play, they get a variety of experiences playing against. The game is not well served by a balanced Skarner that no one plays. Now, we have to make the best version of Skarner that we can, make him fun, make him compelling, make him good, without having to just give him raw power. Absolutely. So a couple things here. One, actually, so a preface here is, I think we can give Skarner a lot of his early laning phase back. When we finally removing the kidnap and also lowering a lot of the damage from Q3, I think did a ton for making his early laning phase feel a lot less oppressive. I think we have a lot of room for early Skarner 1v1 power, which means we can look at things like his passive. We can look at things like, maybe not Q so much, because the counterplay that was so low that you just were guaranteed to take 50% max health physical damage from the early game, and it was kind of unavoidable. I don't think we can give that Q damage back without making you wait a long time for it. I don't even think waiting for level 9 is appropriate. This has to be really slow somehow. Either it has a really, really slow burn, bonus AD ratio or something, or it's just not allowed to come in early, because level 9 is still laning phase. But I think we have a lot of room to give him power in levels 1 through 7. And so it's base health by, I think it's only 20, and base AD by 3. This should do a fair bit for his ability to duel back in top lane. Keep in mind that Q gives attack speed, and I believe it's technically an attack reset, although in most cases you won't know because your attack timer is not that far from the spell timer on Q, but technically. It is significantly more resilience and trading power in the early game. For a normal champion, this would be about 1.5% win rate to a generic top lane fighter. It's probably going to be a little bit less than this in the jungle, because his jungle is relying on Q up almost all the time. He's casting a lot of E's, casting a lot of W's, has infinite mana. His passive is always on, so the relative value of this 3 AD is going to be generally lower in the jungle, because his clear is going to be using all these other things instead. We're also immediately buffing the bonus AD ratio on Q. We're always willing to support Juggernaut Skarner as an alt build. He's a tank, but he's a tank and a Juggernaut. And so being able to build Sterix, Titanic, whatever, was totally fine. We ended up really severely undershooting his bonus AD ratios on launch. We've been trying to continue to rebuff them over time to get to the point where Titanic can feel good, Sterix can feel good, probably not Hullbreaker, but Overlord's Bloodmail could feel good. All these kind of items, hey, we'd be totally down to open up these Juggernaut items to him, so let's buff this thing here. Maybe E gets an AD ratio somewhere, I'm not sure. We gotta figure all this kind of stuff out, right? A is another place that makes intuitive sense for a bonus AD ratio. Probably not W, that kind of place seems too low. But, maybe it's actually allowed to be Q and it's fine, and we can just keep going harder. We'll figure it out over time. But this is while we're here, it's a really easy change. We're committed to letting Juggernaut Skarner be a thing, so here's a buff. This should be, again, about 1.5% win rate in top lane, probably a little bit less than that in the jungle. This should put Skarner's jungle win rates to very appropriate. I am hoping players will have fun playing him. I'm hoping that they feel good about his clear, that they feel good about his ganks, they feel good about his dueling. I think we're pretty far from a good feeling Skarner top lane right now. This might have to be making his cost low again. I'm not sure. It's tough, because now that Kidnap is gone, that was actually one of the primary things that made him a really good and abusive top laner. But again, I also want to reiterate that Skarner's win rates are heavily deflated because people are not far up the master curve yet, and he's actually pretty difficult. That's just kind of the way it is. It's just kind of true with this champion. Moving on to Wukong, simple Wukong buff here. Wukong is very easy, very straightforward. His combos are pretty intuitive. Wukong is a pretty easy champion. So he's 50% win rate in top lane and 49-ish in the jungle. I think realistically, Wukong can be 51 in both roles. If he doesn't get pro jailed. I think this champion is relatively easy to play and straightforward, and that's probably a fairly appropriate win rate for him. 51 in top and 50 in jungle is roughly what's happening here. He has basically no pro presence, and again, this champion is weaker than he's supposed to be in solo queue, so free real estate, absolute free buff here. Here's a fighter who used to be pro jailed, who isn't. Great, we get to buff him. Awesome. We're buffing the base armor on his passive by 1. 2 reasons for this. One, this actually allows mathematically, if you don't buy any bonus armor, the percent physical durability from full stacking it to be roughly the same across level. So because it's currently 5 to 9, The late game value of his passive is higher than the early game value of his passive, assuming you're only buying like plus health and like ability haste and attack damage or whatever. By raising it by a flat 1, this disproportionately buffs it early game, which makes that flat. I'm a nerd. I like these kind of things. I did the math to look at it, and this is relatively close. I don't want to go to decimals. That's stupid. It's also worth noting, by the way, that he always gets 1 stack of his passive at all times. So he goes from having a flat +5 bonus armor to a flat +6 bonus armor. This technically makes the jungle pet do more damage because jungle pets have armor and MR ratios. And of course, he gets another +1 armor per stack of his passive, again up to 6. So he is always at 1 to 6 higher armor at all points in time. Normally 3 armor is about 1% win rate. This is 1 to 6 fluctuating. It's probably a little bit under 1% win rate. But also, in a world where here's Wukong, he's a champion who says, I print armor. I am an armor champion. I have high armor. That actually being good and strong seems really valuable, right? Wukong technically has, I think this puts him at 37 armor level 1, which is like top 20%, I think, of champions. Of course, it immediately goes to like 42 the second you hit somebody. So, you know, he does actually have, like, in functional gameplay, the highest level 1 armor outside of things like Rammus and Malphite. So it's good that it's true, but even if he's not hitting targets, he has functionally one of the highest armors in the game as well, which I think is valuable. The other thing is just buffing his E attack speed. There was a quality of life change that I don't think it's taken in this patch, but I want to do for next patch. It was suggested by one of the other designers on the team, which is to have the E attack speed buff duration pause during R. I don't believe it does currently, and we usually do this. So, like, for example, Skarner's Q duration pauses during his E. We should do this for Wukong. It'll be in next patch 90%. It won't be in this patch 90%. Maybe I'll have time tomorrow morning. I'm not sure. There's some risk in getting it wrong and breaking something, so it's probably gonna be next patch. But buffing attack speed back up on the E, because one thing I've noticed about Wukong's current builds is, this champion kind of has to one-shot you. I think he actually has pretty bad growth durability. His health growth is under 100. That's pretty bad for a melee champion. Yeah, he can turn invisible. Yeah, he's kind of evasive, whatnot. But like, my current like obsession is, let's make melee champions feel like they're functional in combat. And some of this is just simply how much damage in the game, absolutely, right? And lowering the amount of damage and lowering the amount of gold in the game will help with that sum. I think that is quite meaningful. And some of this can be tweaking fighter items, make sure that they're durable enough, whatnot. But anytime a diver like Vi or Wukong are building lethality, and Wukong's current builds are pretty much lethality builds right now, means that it doesn't feel like he can play diver instead. It doesn't feel like he can build the Stride Breaker, Death's Dance, Sterix Gauge type of items and feel functional when that's the case. This might mean his base damages suck. This might mean his overall durability is not good. This might mean his overall cooldowns are too long. There's a lot of things this could be. I have not spent time deep diving into what the issues with Wukong are, but I would certainly like to make sure this champion can feel good building fighter. I made changes to Vi late last year, I think. They did a really good job of getting her like less pro-jailed and getting her to be able to build fighter and feel good about it, and they were generally pretty successful. So hope to do that as well. I mean, this worked for Aatrox on top, so worked for Rek'Sai. So I've had a pretty good track record with making champions feel like functional fighters. Sometimes it takes time for players to adopt their builds, but usually they've been well received. Usually they've been pretty positive, and I think they're good for League of Legends. And again, this can be approached from a couple different scenarios here, from a couple of different avenues, but in general, yeah, how I'm feeling about the kind of stuff. So, okay, great. Wukong getting strictly buffed by about 1 to 1.5% win rate. Corki is getting strictly nerfed. Corki is extremely elite skewed. So his generic win rate looks bad in solo queue. If you look at higher MRs, it's fairly reasonable. But ultimately, Corki is like the #1 pro play mid laner, and that's not good, unfortunately. One thing that's actually true right now is because I had done all of the post-update Corki tuning, is though we got Corki to a state where he's comfortable maxing Q, which is a good thing, we are in a state where most of Q's power is in wave clear. And what I wanted was like, yeah, Corki's an aggressive champion. You can like try to Q the enemy and try to poke them and look for all-ins. And like, if you W forward, Q is easier to hit. If you W forward, you're guaranteed to land your E shred, like all these things. And the funny thing is, like, when we had Emax Corki, he was in fact aggressive and a bully, and he played really up there, and he was, you know, really good at trying to frag people. I think we're at a state now where he's wave clear machine, and he's still good in the early game, but he's kind of wave clear machine. It's like, well, that sucks a little bit. His early game should still be around aggression. I still think like him maxing Q first is better than him maxing E first. I think it's overall kind of better. Q has some variance into it, but ultimately the nerfs here are cooldown, one of the cooldown buffs on Q getting reverted, and the mana cost being brought up to 80 flat mana. This actually lowers a disincentive to rank up Q because you don't increase the Q anymore, but it means that early game Corki has fewer Qs via cooldown and fewer Qs via mana cost, which means if he's pressing Q to wave clear, he's gonna sooner, and his wave clear is going to be worse. If he's pressing Q to poke you down or to take fights, well, if you're all-inning every time your E is up, cooldown's not going to really matter here. And if you're all-inning off of your E whatnot, a difference in 15, 20 mana on Q is not going to be as big of a deal because it's 15, 20 mana off of a very large set you're all kind of pushing in together. So yeah, Q is still not a very good poke tool. I buffed the missile speed when I did the update, a little while ago, but not enough to make it feel like it's a really good harass skill. I was just kind of worried about being like actually just really reliable poke, but maybe I shouldn't have been. And maybe I should have buffed the missile speed more. It's one of the slower missiles in the game for sure. Maybe that was incorrect and not buff as much, but anyway, he's currently tuned to be a really strong wave clear bot, and that's not great. I would really like if long-term Corki felt like a really functional bot laner as well. Unfortunately, right now, because it's like so clearly the AD carry meta and his win rates are like very clearly not good in bot lane anymore, Corki is just, doing too well in mid. It's especially true in elite solo queue. It's especially true in pro play. So yeah, we have to nerf him. Lucian is getting adjusted. We are taking 10 flat damage off of the Q, and we are adding 5% total AD ratio to each shot. If he gets 2 buffs at a time, he can hold 4 to his damage via his when buffed passive, right? This triggers when somebody attacks somebody hit by your W. This triggers when somebody gives you a heal or a shield. This triggers when somebody CCs somebody near you. So, he has a lot of ways of getting this buff, but unless he's getting a gank from somebody else or getting a shield from Ivern in the jungle, he is not going to access his passive when playing mid lane. He's simply going to lose 10 Q damage. If you're playing a bot lane, you're losing 10 Q damage, but you're also getting that back pretty much right away via the passive. The goal is to be power neutral in bot lane and to take about 1% win rate off of Lucian mid. The nice thing is we have this passive for a reason. It's to give us a bot versus mid tuning lever. We are pulling it because Lucian is like the number 2 mid laner in pro right now, even though the vast majority of solo queue players have a 45% win rate on Lucian. And we don't want to have to nerf this guy and make him a bad bot laner. So yes, we're making him rely on his teammates a bit more. Sorry, but the alternative is that Lucian just sucks everywhere for solo queue, and that's actually a worse situation. So that's what's going on here. That is, I believe, the end. That is the end of the patch. Pretty long one. Thanks for watching. See you next time. Bye-bye.